Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial we're going to continue our talk about Trapcode form and the base form settings. In the last lesson we spoke about the box grid, and we explored some different ways to manipulate the box grid in Trapcode form using things like the fractal field. Today we're going to talk about a different base form, and we'll talk about some other methods to manipulate the particles using something called disperse and twist. So in the last lesson, you learned that we can create particles along grids in 3D space. We can have particles in X and Y as well as Z. So in the default settings, we have 70 by 70 particles in X and Y and 3 sets of particles in Z. When we select box strings, you notice that particles in X is grayed out because what it assumes is that we are creating strings that form along the x-axis. If I set this to 1 string in Z and maybe 12 strings in the Y, we can see these a little bit better. Essentially, they're lines drawn in 3D space that react in 3D space. Now, the important thing to remember here is that these lines are drawn with particles. And that's an important concept to understand, especially if you want to understand all of the different settings in here. So let's take a look at these string settings down here, which is only usable when you're using box strings, by the way. The first setting in here is density, and this relates to what I was just talking about, how the particles are squished together in this string. A density of 15 is usually pretty good and allows us to create a string without a whole lot of gaps in between. Anything above 15 should really only be used if you're starting to see individual particles because you've perhaps set the particle size to a much larger size and you start to see some of the spaces in between, which we can see a little bit here if I turn up the particle size. But if I turn this density down to a low number like 2, we can see these dots start to appear, and if I bring the size up, we can see that, yes, it is indeed just particles. Now, generally, you're going to leave that density at 15 unless you have some reason to start thinning it out, in like this example that I did here. Now, below that, we have size random. Now, notice down here in the particle section, we also have size random. So what's the difference between the two? Well, when we're working with strings, in the base form, Trapcode form considers the strings to be one object. So if I turn up the size random in the string settings, the strings will be sized randomly. If I turn up the size random in the particle section, the particles will be sized randomly. Notice that we can kind of mix and match here. We can have random strings and random particle sizes. That's just fine. They work well together. Below size random, we have a size random distribution. Trapcode products have a number of random distribution controls, and rarely are you going to touch them. What these controls do is give us control over the distribution of the random values chosen by the random number generator that's picking these random values. Now, if you really want to know, what you really control with your random distribution is what percentage of values fall closer to the original value. So let's say the original value is 1. Are most of the random values going to fall close to 1, or are they going to fall more at the extremes? When we turn the random distribution up or down, what we're doing is either bringing values closer to the original and less likely to be at the extremes, or when you turn it up, we'll have values that are more spread out and values that are more evenly distributed across the set of random values. Now, is that something that you desperately need for your string random size? Quite possibly not, but you never know. More importantly, though, is the ability to taper the size of those particles towards the end. Although we don't have numeric control over where the tapering starts and how big it is when it starts and ends, we do have a couple different options in our tapering size and opacity. Essentially, we have two options that look a little bit different. When we have smooth tapering the tapering gets very small at the end because we're basically kind of easing out and easing into the taper. So the very small values almost become invisible, even though they're still there towards the ends. Linear basically does a linear taper towards the edges. So it's a little bit more sudden of a drop off towards the end, but you see more of the edge of the form. And of course, you can mix and match size and opacity, linear or smooth tapering. I'm actually just going to set this size random down to 0 and jump to our next topic, which is disperse and twist. The disperse and twist section has 2 controls inside, and I'll give you a guess as to what those controls are. One is disperse and the other is twist. Disperse randomizes the positions of the strings. Now, if we were to set this to box grid, what we'd be doing is randomizing the positions of all of the particles. But remember, box strings groups the strings together. So in the case of disperse, what we do is randomly distribute the strings, not the individual particles. Twist, quite simply, creates a twisting distortion of the form shape. Now, I mentioned in another tutorial that Trapcode products tend to arrange the interface in the order that things are calculated. So the base form is before disperse and twist. So from that, you might figure that the form itself, if we rotate it, is actually going to be rotating before any twisting distortion. So what that means is that the base form is actually going to move through the twisting distortion. And this is what that looks like. If I go to Y rotation and I start to rotate in the Y or Z axes, it starts to look a little weird. The X rotation is actually okay because the twist is pointing straight through the X axis. But when you'd like to take something that's twisted and actually rotate it around, you have another section down here called World Transform. And this is very handy to have. X does exactly what we were doing with X in the base form. But things like Y rotation or Z rotation can be freely rotated, scaled, and moved around. Now, notice where World Transform is. It's after disperse and twist. It's after spherical field. It's after the fractal field and all that kind of stuff. So all of these things, the disperse, twist, fractal field, spherical field, and kaleidospace, which we haven't covered yet, will all get affected by the World Transform. Now, a little bit of twist goes a long way, so I'm going to bring this down to about 8, and I'll size out the base form just a little bit more. In fact, I'm going to have even less twist than that. Like that. Now let's add a little bit of color. In the previous tutorial, I spoke about quick maps and how we have internal maps that we can use to apply to our particles. But another option we have is the particle section, and we have a color control of the particles that make up the form itself. So I could set this whole thing to orange without having to deal with any sort of color mapping. If I'd like that color to change over time, though, I'll have to forget about the particle section and jump back into the quick maps. I could also use layer maps, but we'll get into that in another lesson. So remember, this is a one-dimensional map. So we need to pick one dimension of the 3 to map it to. So if I set it to X, we'll see that we have this, well, we can't quite see the red because it's tapering off. So let's go to base form, string settings, taper off. There we go. So now we see we have like a red, orange, yellow, green, and blue. Nice little spectrum kind of thing. There's a few preset maps in here, so I could pick one of these. Now if I set this to Y, it's going to map it top to bottom, except for where the twist actually flips it upside down. Again, quick maps are before disperse and twist, though the twisting is actually going to twist the color map around. I'll just leave this off and have a nice little orange for my particles. Now let's start this thing rotating. I could go into my base form here, but I'll stick to what I said about the World Transform being a good idea to rotate the whole thing. So I'm going to set 1 full revolution over the course of 10 seconds. So this will just have a slow rotation to it. Maybe I'll expand the size Y just a bit. And perhaps I'll rotate the camera. Give a little bit different angle there. Let's move this in the X just a bit. There we go. So now I'm going to duplicate this and add the large particles on top. So mostly these two layers are going to share the same settings, but I want to go into the string settings and turn that density way down so we start to see those individual particles. And I'll turn up the size of the particles. And also the size random. We'll turn the sphere feather down so we get some nice solid particles on there. Go. Look at it from whatever angle you'd like. So that covers the concepts behind using the box strings. It's kind of the same, but kind of different. And there's a lot of things you can do with it. Next, we'll get into using spheres and OBJs in the next topic. So we'll see you in the next lesson.